Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is now week 15 of the Men Engage Ubuntu Symposium, our third global symposium. So my name is Tom Holmbrook, and I work with the Men Engage Global Secretariat. And so my role is communications, and so I'm particularly excited for the topics today being presented, which are all relating to narratives, media representation, storytelling, and both talking about traditional narratives in media as well as maybe more subversive or counter narratives and ways of reimagining masculinities through storytelling, critical reflection, and of course media. That's kind of one of the unifying themes of our presenters today. So yeah, thanks so much for joining. I'm actually joining from Australia, and although it's a little bit late here, it's definitely a conversation I think worth staying up for. So thanks for everyone who's joining live. Good to see a few familiar names there as well joining, so welcome. And we are recording the session, so we're going to be putting this on the Men Engage YouTube channel. Thanks everyone who's watching this on YouTube as well, and do check out our other videos there. We've got a whole treasure trove of videos from this symposium coming out on so many different topics, all related to men and masculinities and engaging men and boys in gender justice and social justice. Before we get going, I'm gonna invite you all to unmute just for a second and just say hello in whatever language you prefer. So please, whenever you're ready, I'm gonna ask to unmute now. And please just say a warm hello in your preferred language. Okay, good.
Ni hao from Hong Kong.
Good morning.
Hi from New Delhi.
Goedemiddag vanuit Nederland.
Hello from the US.
From New Delhi, India.
Hola de España.
Hello from Oxford, UK.
Hello from Cambridge, UK.
Great. Well, okay, thanks everyone. I'm just going to mute everybody now, but thanks everyone for joining. Good to hear different languages and voices and places you're joining from in the world. Before we begin with the discussion today, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm joining from today and pay my respects to the elders past and present here and the traditional owners of other indigenous lands you may be joining from around the world. In the area where I'm based, which is Melbourne, Australia, the people who lived here were the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And having moved to Australia recently, I've been learning that this kind of acknowledgement is a really important, it's small but important way to remind ourselves and respect the history and heritage and cultures of the people of the lands where I now live and work. And for me, that at least means committing to learning and understanding more about the Aboriginal history in and around Melbourne. And this area was actually long been a meeting place for different clans of the Kulin Nation before British and European settlers arrived. And this is all, related to what Men Engage has the intention and making efforts towards decolonizing practices, narratives, and mindsets. So, and just sharing this map as well of some of the, of the many, many nations, Aboriginal nations of Australia. So, a few housekeeping things before we get going. First, we do have a service available called Wordly. You should be able to go to the top left usually, or maybe it's the little dots at the bottom of your screen, and then you can click them and go live on custom streaming service. And so this Wordly service is basically subtitles available in different languages. So you click live custom stream service, and then you go to view stream on custom service, it says there. So that will open up this new window in Wordly. It's going to be in a separate browser window, and that's going to allow you to choose from one of 18 languages, including English, if you just want to follow with English subtitles. It's a computer-generated, in artificial intelligence kind of program. So there's some translations that are funny, some that are maybe a bit awkward, but overall, I think it's a good way to help people follow along who might not be familiar with English as well. So please do make use of that. As we go along, we're going to hear from different speakers, but please do share your questions in the chat box. We're going to actually have a Q&A session at the end where you'll be able to unmute yourselves, but do use the chat box in the meantime. The speakers might not be able to see those questions as we go, but we'll try and address as many as we can at the end. And actually, we're hoping to share contact details at the end if you want to get in contact with them to follow up on anything. Also, there's the hashtag Ubuntu Symposium. If you hear anything interesting, please tweet it on Twitter. I've been trusted with the keys to the MenEngage Twitter account, so I will look at all the best tweets there and share them from our MenEngage. So just tag us as well, at MenEngage. And with that, this is just a page about finding out about the other amazing discussions we have, menengage.org/symposium. Yeah, so here's a great lineup of speakers today, and I'm just going to go through quickly in reverse order, actually, to how we'll be into the order we're going to hear from them. So we've got Shohini, who is based in India. Shohini is sharing some very interesting insights based on examples from TikTok on the ways technology and digital spaces can be places for empowerment, subversion of harmful norms and ideas, and challenging traditional masculinities. And I know TikTok's one of those kind of social media accounts or platforms that can be a bit of a mystery if you're like me. There's cultures and subcultures that kind of appear and disappear in a heartbeat. So it's going to be really interesting to hear from Shohini on insights, especially from the Indian context. Before Shohini, we are hearing from Russ Ervin Funk, based in the US. So Russ is going to be sharing about a program in the US that asks men to critically examine a type of media that actually accounts for more than a third of all internet downloads globally. I've researched recently. So it's a type of media that's downloaded and used and viewed so much, but not talked about much, and certainly not as much as it should be. And the type of media we're talking about is pornography. And Russ is going to be sharing about a program that encourages and challenges men to critically reflect as a group on their experiences of pornography. So before that, we're going to hear from Saraswati Chatterjee and Mahika Banerjee from Breakthrough India, and sharing how they at Breakthrough use mainstream media formats such as short films, music videos, social media to question mainstream narratives of masculinity, but also presenting diverse and alternative role models of what it means to be a man. And so again, as someone in communications and trying to use communications for social change, I'm very much looking forward to that talk because, and always excited to hear from examples from Breakthrough India, who are always doing amazing work in this area. And then before all of that, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jocelyn Lehrer, who is going to be sharing about a project that works with men over a period of time, culminating in them sharing personal and sometimes very often very sensitive stories of change in front of a live audience. So it's a process that I imagine is daunting and scary and very vulnerable, but I think incredibly radical when you think about it, and transformative, undoubtedly. Jocelyn is a founder and director of the Men's Story Project and senior gender integration consultant with the Stanford University Global Center for Gender Equality. Her areas of expertise include gender-based violence and HIV/AIDS prevention and response, promotion of healthy masculinities, and gender equality, and the use of storytelling for social change, of course. Jocelyn holds a doctoral degree from Harvard School of Public Health and completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of California, San Francisco, Center for AIDS Prevention Studies. And with that, thank you very much, Jocelyn, for joining, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm very glad to be here with you today. And as I get going, I'm going to share a screen. I would actually love to also invite folks, if you want to put your name and what organization or where you're coming from into the chat. I think it'd be wonderful for us to get to know more about our audience as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'd like to start at the beginning. So I guess you're going to get a preview now of what's coming. All right. Okay, so the title of this talk is The Men's Story Project, Men Taking a Public Stand for Healthy Masculinities and Gender Justice. To give a quick overview of this 20-minute presentation, I'm going to be giving a quick overview of the nexus of masculinities, health, and social justice, where these topics intersect, a summary of what the Men's Story Project is and our work to date, impacts and feedback that we've received, next steps, and then an invitation to collaborate. So please know that that is coming, and I'm really eager to connect with everyone here. So to start off, this is a collage of social problems from a US standpoint that are intertwined and interlinked with social ideas about masculinity. So it's just a visual. And here's a more didactic list. And there are themes that are common around the world. So around the world, research has been finding steadily that, we certainly know that gender norms affect well-being for people of all genders. And we're learning that around the world, men who espouse harmful or rigid ideas about masculinity are more likely to perpetrate or experience a wide range of health and justice problems, including the ones listed here. Right, so they're more likely to engage in bullying and hazing. They're more likely to espouse or perpetrate different forms of gender-based violence, sexual risk behaviors, have homophobic and transphobic views, do less work or childcare around the house, housework or childcare, espouse gender inequality across domains, and then relationally, more likely to have less intimate relationships, seek mental and physical health care later and less than women, with all kinds of implications for their health outcomes, more likely to experience symptoms of depression, being affected by substance abuse, risky driving, which means higher rates of car accidents and deaths in men. And then overall, what we're seeing around the world is, and recent studies have been showing, that men die on average a handful of years earlier than women, often due to higher rates of their risk behaviors and lower rates of self-protective behaviors, all potentially linked to ways in which they're enacting their masculinity. In other words, these are preventable factors. So with these challenges in mind, in 2008 in San Francisco, I started this project called the Men's Story Project. And it's a replicable movement building initiative. It's a storytelling and dialogue project that brings critical exploration of masculinity into public forums through men's own voices and stories. And when I was starting this project, I was working as a researcher. I had also worked as a rape crisis counselor. I had also spent several years facilitating HIV support groups, mostly for young gay men and transgender women in the US who were living with HIV, worked with a gang risk intervention program. And it was just, all the roads were pointing to this topic of masculinities. And I was thinking, how can we generate more critical public dialogue on this issue that seems to be a root cause contributor to so many different forms of preventable pain and suffering for people of all genders. So that's the root of the project in brief and in part. But so the project aims to strengthen attitudes, behaviors, and norms that support healthy masculinities and gender justice by creating these live local storytelling events with local storytellers, and then filming those events to create locally relevant films, social media, which can then in turn be used for more film screenings, workshops. So you end up with locally relevant educational tools based on the stories of local men and folks who identify with masculinity. So I'll play here a quick trailer, which is from our first live production long ago, which gives a quick sense of what the project can look and feel like in a local setting.
I love men.
There's social training, right? There's ideas of how boys and girls and men and women are supposed to act and look and feel.
So I'm super nervous. Very nervous.
It's time to break the cycle, to stop the alcohol abuse, to stop the violence of my father and the violence of my father's father, of all the men in my family who had killed in the name of honor.
Urinal or stall? Stall or urinal? My body and mind and soul stepping into the spotlight.
Yeah. I became hostage to an image of gender. Women good, men evil.
I work out 4 hours a day. I work out when I sit on the couch.
I decided to tell my parents that I was gay.
Stand aside while Felicia and I guide our children past racism and hate.
This project is about healing.
It's the place where the floss was yearn. Gold teeth and bling ice on.
All day I'd been wondering if I could get it up. After all, they were about to cut my ball off. It's not good for the libido.
It feels so good before.
I chose to be male to express it outwardly, what I felt within, but I didn't choose and don't choose all the baggage that comes along with being a man in this society.
This is to Jason and to Greg and to Steve and Chris and Dave.
We are part of the silent majority of African American men, and we are proud to be loving and compassionate men.
So that was our first live event, and since then, building this project has been a real labor of love. So this is a quick overview of what a typical production can look like. So basically, that first production led me to write a training guide and start thinking about, what could it look like if this kind of work started happening far and wide in different settings, led by different groups in a locally relevant way. And so right now, the structure of the project is as follows. Usually in most productions, there's anywhere between 3 and 14 presenters, and they share very personal stories in front of a live audience of their local community or campus. And then that's followed by a facilitated dialogue with the audience. When it's live, there's also a resource and action fair for audience members to immediately get connected with personal support resources or activism opportunities. And over time, I have kind of distilled the topics that storytellers are sharing on as celebrating, challenging, and resisting. So celebrating sources of beauty and love and meaning in their life, challenging social ideas about masculinity that need to be challenged, which have fostered harm in their own life and as they perpetrate or are on the receiving end or witnesses and so on. And then also resisting intersecting forms of oppression. Also that in terms of sharing stories of unlearning, how they unlearned homophobia as an example, or what it's been like for them to be on the receiving end of racism and speaking up about that. The format of engaging the presenters is something that I've been iterating over time based on continual feedback from audience members, presenters, and production leaders. And so right now, what I'm suggesting is that groups put together at least 6 to 8 weekly workshops of 2.5 hours each, where there's an opportunity for the storytellers themselves to build community amongst themselves and learn together and give each other feedback on their works in progress, challenge each other productively, calling each other in, as they say. And the workshops tend to be structured now where the first half is a learning module on a given topic that pertains to intersectional gender justice. And the second half of the workshop is a story circle where they share their works in progress and give each other feedback. And that's accompanied by one-on-one coaching outside of the group. And so the goal is really to build a safe, brave, and creative community that can foster the storytellers' learning and growth while they hone their pieces for public sharing. The presenters have been very diverse in terms of walks of life and identities and age, ranging from 12 to 74 at this point. And then again, the events locally are filmed to create social media films, and then educational materials can be built around that media, like discussion guides or even curriculum. And we've seen some of these groups then go on to form ongoing groups because these live productions generate community and also momentum and excitement. So this is just a quick snapshot of work to date, 32 live productions in the US, Chile, where my family is from, Canada, Gaza, and the West Bank, worked with lots of campuses, worked with lots of amazing nonprofit organizations and UN Women. We've filmed 2 of these with enough of a production value that they were to make 2 documentaries, which have been used on hundreds of campuses as educational tools. We've published 2 evaluation studies that I'll talk about briefly later. And then there's been media coverage and the opportunity to share about this work. And I'll just point out the bottom 2 bullets. One is that I have developed a training package to help this work spread and grow and be locally adapted and implemented and integrated with other programs. And then we have a website and a YouTube channel that highlight the stories and the work that's being done. This is just to share some visuals of the work. Here's a 500-seat theater, so we learned that we can do it in a big space. Just good vibes. Smaller space also worked. Very small production, but they filled a 250-seat theater for 5 storytellers. This is the work in Gaza, so we learned that we can do this in a traditional conservative context, and that it's feasible and acceptable to do so. This is a production in Chile that included some celebrities. This is a production that included T-shirts, very important. So these are just some images. We learned also that we can do this online. Last year we did this production, the workshops and the events were all online, and it actually facilitated people's participation. So I'm gonna kind of go quickly through some of the background and the findings. So the theoretical framework of the project is that social construction is perspective on gender. In other words, ideas about gender are socially constructed and therefore changeable. It aims to be a gender transformative program insofar as we're engaging audience members and presenters in a critical reflection on gender norms and their effects on health and justice outcomes and experiences for people. It's guided by an intersectionality framework, which says that gender in this case is not the only identity that shapes a person's life. Our lives are affected by all of the identities that we hold in ways in which some of them are linked with more or less power or privilege in society or oppression. So we have to consider people's intersecting identities as we think about their life and life in general. Social cognitive theory is a key theory used for the creation of social change media to think about how do people influence each other in terms of how they can behave as role models through their actions and the stories that they share. And then diffusion of innovations is a theory that helps us think about how do we diffuse a new idea or a new program in a community or in a society so that it starts to feel normal. And so here the innovations are men sharing personal stories that challenge ideas about masculinity on the one hand, and then the Men's Story Project as a scalable project also. So the presenters in the Men's Story Project are people who are all raising their hands and saying, I have a personal life story that I want to share because I think it could potentially be helpful for other people to hear it. or I think it could be helpful for me to share it as a part of my healing journey. But I think that it'll be a social positive if this story is in the world. And so over time, we've worked with, at this point, probably around 140 or so presenters. One of the key themes, as Tom alluded to, is journeys of change. So presenters have shared all kinds of stories, including how they went about a journey of ending their own use of violence, ending their perpetration of intimate partner violence specifically. How they chose to seek support for their mental health needs or for porn addiction, how they unlearned homophobia and why. We've heard stories of, for example, people coming out as gay, bi, trans, non-binary, silence breaking in terms of sharing their stories of survivorship of childhood sexual abuse, resilience in terms of asserting that they are, for example, a loving and kind man, even though they are viewed as dangerous and threatening by white people because they are a Black man of size, for example. How they stepped in to prevent violence or harassment, or how they used to perpetrate sexual harassment at work and now they commit to not doing so. So these are very candid stories. And then when they're all sharing together, it becomes a modeling of solidarity of men of very different identities and backgrounds, standing together, sharing their stories together in common cause. And one of the important things with all of this is that for the journeys of change, that they talk about how they did so, not just, hey, I went from A to B, but how they did so that and what the effects of those changes that they've made have been for their life, how they dealt with obstacles along the way of that journey of change, and how they persisted. And that really helps audience members get a sense that, oh, this is really doable. It's beneficial to do so. And because this person is local, because they're a peer or role model up on that stage, I also get the sense that maybe I could do that too, because they're like me or I want to be like them. And then an emphasis on humility. The introduction to this work is in the training guide. Key bullet points that I think are important to include. And one of them is just framing the overall events as, we want to really thank our presenters for their willingness to share their stories, knowing full well that we're all works in progress. So this is not about putting people up on a stage on pedestals and saying that they are perfected human works, but rather sharing stories from life in progress. I'm going to skip a little bit to go over here. So we do have 2 published evaluation studies. If you're interested in receiving them, please email me afterward. We're going to share our email addresses. But briefly, we had these evaluation studies where we interviewed audience members and presenters, around 30 audience members, 20 presenters. And some of the findings I'll summarize quickly. For audience members, what was it for them to hear, in this case, stories from around 14 men on topics that they had never necessarily heard people live of their own local community sharing. So for audience members, themes, and this also comes through in audience feedback forms that we collect at every event, a greater understanding of masculinities and intersectionality. For many men in the audience, a sense of personal affirmation and realizing that they're not alone. Viewing the presenters as role models, as friends, a sense of identification with them. Importantly, reevaluation of their own prejudices and stereotypes, because now they're getting to hear personal stories from people of identities different from their own. Intention to reduce gender policing, in other words, the enforcement of rigid gender norms. Hundreds of hours of discussion with people in their social networks. And then for the presenters in our study, and then also consistently over time, they've shared this sense of pride, empowerment, a sense of healing and new meaning, also prejudice reduction from having had the opportunity to build relationships with men of backgrounds different from their own over the group process, and also increased gender justice activism subsequently, such as starting a men's collective, publishing a memoir about their experience witnessing witnessing domestic violence as a child, and so on. These are just some quick quotes from audience members that we get in the feedback forms that I feel are worth highlighting because they're so potent. I laughed, cried, and rethought my own prejudices. It was life-altering. I gained a desire to change some of the aspects of my own behavior. opened my eyes to the healing process and allowed me to see the steps others have taken toward healing. This is a quote from a presenter. He sent this to me 10 years after his participation. He had shared a story of his own perpetration of domestic violence, and he wrote at the bottom here, I'll just quote this last sentence, telling my story of violence publicly was a turning point in my life because I was inviting the community to hold me accountable for breaking the cycle of abuse in my life and to see the hope I had for my own healing. So quickly, key lessons. This is relational work and relationships matter. So having trained facilitators is important. The intersectional social justice perspective is key. I've learned that it's really powerful to support people in reflecting on their own life experience as the fodder, as a substrate for their learning. And then sharing their stories publicly is that form of social action. And it's important for this work to be done in a trauma-informed way with rigorous attention to harm prevention and accountability, which I can talk more about in the discussion if folks are interested. Next steps, I'm eager to collaborate with groups. So to create new productions, there's training and coaching available, training resources, as I mentioned, a training guide, webinars, and so on. I'd love to work with NGOs as national regional stewards of the work. I think this work can be readily integrated with other gender transformative programs, like public culminations of other multi-session programs that might be carried out with men and boys, where this could be a reinforcement module and evaluated as such. And then I think this work can be done with people of all genders and adapted in different kinds of ways. And so I'd love to just continue growing and the work and building a network of groups far and wide who are learning and collaborating and sharing learnings. And then also helping to visibilize this work as a linked set of initiatives around the world. And people have found that to be heartening to know, wow, this is happening in Canada and Chile and Gaza and the US, and where else could it happen in the world? And so these are some of the resources, again, available. And people, students can get involved for course credit, studies can be done. This is a painting from one of our presenters in Chile. And I'll just close with this quote, storytelling for preserving and passing on traditions, but also for challenging and breaking traditions and creating new traditions. So this is my contact, and feel free to be in touch.
Oh, thanks, Jocelyn. I was about to hit unmute and then everything moved around when you stopped sharing screen. So thanks for that. And I think, yeah, I do think it's a really radical act and approach in a way that if done correctly, and I think what you've just laid out shows how it can be done in a really sensitive and transformative way. So thanks for sharing that. I have lots of questions. I hope others do. Please put them in the chat box and we can hopefully get to them at the end and also exchange ideas with the next presenters. So next up, we actually have, we're going to have co-presenters from Breakthrough India. It's Saswati Chatterjee and Mahika Banerjee, and they are part of the digital content team at Breakthrough India, which is an organization founded in India working towards making violence against women unacceptable. Mahika manages the online volunteering program with Breakthrough and moonlights as a freelance writer for feminist publications, which is super cool. Saswati is Senior Coordinator of Digital Engagement and has been working in the development sector for over 2 years. And she's a keen fan of speculative fiction, especially feminist sci-fi and fantasy. So please ask Saswati for all the recommendations on feminist readings or films there in the chat box if you're interested, which I hope you are. So over to you, Saswati and Mahika.
Thank you so much, Tom. And yeah, thanks for the introduction. So just before we begin, I'd like to do a quick introduction to Breakthrough. Breakthrough, the organization Breakthrough, works towards making violence and discrimination against women and girls unacceptable. We challenge deeply rooted gender norms by working with adolescents and their communities, as well as by using media campaigns, the arts, and popular culture to build a more equal world around us. In our line of work, we are often faced with questions like, Why would men want to give up that power? We have often found our answers by acknowledging that men are constantly negotiating with masculinity. The alternative that we're looking for may not be an outright rejection of masculinity, but it could be located in these everyday negotiations with masculinity. With this as our overarching thought, we are here today to share some of our learnings from our line of work. One of the first themes that we will address, and the narratives that we came up to kind of address it and counter it, comprise masculinity and violence. To begin with, we have no intention to condemn masculinity in its entirety. What we do take to task here is the structurally rooted presence of toxic hegemonic masculinity, that which has set in motion deeply entrenched norms and stereotypes about masculinity, and these norms and stereotypes continue to be performed to this day. Beyond identity, expressions, and attributes, masculinity is present in behaviors, relationships, and the power dynamics that we share with each other. Our multiple identities comprise caste, class, tribe, ability, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc., which go on to shape our multiple masculinities. Today, we shall address the dominant form of masculinity and how it is performed in gendered violence. Time to time, we will be presenting videos, be it concept videos or music videos or short stories, that we have made and disseminated, which aim to be conversation starters about tropes of masculinity. Let's begin with the first video. Okay.
हमें ऐसा क्यों लगता है कि अगर कुछ बिगड़ जाए तो उसे मारकर ठीक किया जा सकता है? पर हाथ उठाने से कभी कुछ ठीक हुआ है जो आज होगा? गुस्से में हम अक्सर भूल जाते हैं कि लोग बातों के भूत होते हैं, लातों के नहीं। मसलों का हल बातचीत है, मारपीट नहीं। आज अगर आप बीवी बच्चों पर हाथ उठाएंगे तो कल आपके बच्चे अपने बीवी बच्चों पे हाथ उठाएंगे। इसे यही रोक देते हैं, हाथ नहीं, बात उठाते हैं।
Thank you for that, Shashwati. So in this video, besides making a point about the cyclical nature and the absurdity of resorting to violence, we also felt the need to address that violence does not emerge from the existence of masculinity, but the normalized behaviors and relationships shared between the family members, which sanctions the father to strike. It's also his socio-cultural setting that shaped his impulses and his reflexes to strike at the source of his vexation. With him having done so, hegemonic masculinity, as we know it, heaved a sigh of relief and lived to thrive another day. Our next video kind of also breaks down the components of masculinity, of this hegemonic dominant masculinity. Shashwati, you can start playing it.
Of our imagination. Ideas about masculinity are drilled into our heads in various ways. Family members, the way we dress, our friends, boys' dormitories, locker rooms, the ad and film industry, and so on. So this is made worse by peer pressure, where men are expected to fit into these norms which shouldn't have existed in the first place. As cherry on the cake, physically violent and aggressive behavior patterns are demanded of boys and men. Such as entitlement to public and private spaces. This aggression is also demanded within relationships, especially with the women and girls in their lives. In India, the caste system and toxic masculinity go hand in hand. Brahmin and Kshatriya men embody ideal masculinity. Their position on the top of the caste pyramid allowed this idea of toxic masculinity to infect the rest of the society and become a part of the dominant culture. Remember those popular Amar Chitra Katha comics? They shamelessly catered to stereotypes about caste and masculinity. The gods, goddesses, and Savarna factions were painted as fair-skinned and perpetually good. The Asuras, that is Dalit and Adivasi persons, were demonized and painted as dark-skinned. This dark skin represented irrational evil. Now, some of the gods were dark skinned too, but the creators of the comics were so hell-bent on differentiating and presenting them as good that they were painted.
Okay, thanks. So this toxic hegemonic masculinity has a very rigid list of rules that are to be devoutly followed and performed. This list is centered around core attributes of dominance and gendered violence. Women and non-binary people around him have to be shown their place on the hierarchy below him, or risk punitive measures enacted by acts of violence. When this list of rules is not followed, the person's very identity and existence is considered to be deviant, aka, to quote, not man enough. Falling short of this list of masculine stereotypes and tropes, it generates condemnation from others and anxiety within. Anxiety that is also supposed to be depressed and not see the light of day, further adding to a downward spiral of crisis.
Time for us to evolve.
Remember, the stereotypes about masculinity don't let men talk about their own stories of physical and sexual abuse.
And the myriad of other ways in which patriarchy victimizes men.
A study in the Straits Times found that children being told to man up are 4 times more likely to become bullies.
According to the National Crime Records Bureau, nearly 70% of suicides in India comprise men.
The World Health Organization has acknowledged that the pressures of toxic masculinity and the shorter life expectancy of men go hand in hand.
Taking all of this into account, why are we still telling men to man up?
Thank you, Shashwati. So we make the mistake of thinking that masculinity is all there is to the identity of men. Masculinity alone does not define a man, especially one that thrives in power, imbalances, punishment, and violent actions. Think of masculinity as a serum formula concocted in a lab. It is formed by us by internal and external components. The internal being the identity we are born into, and external components being our socio-cultural circuits that influence us. And this is packaged in performances of violence, exclusion, and bigotry. Toxic hegemonic masculinity has taught us that acts of violence beget respect, integrity, empowerment, awe, and idolization from others. That violence is the key against powerlessness, helplessness, and a crucial tool in quote-unquote marking territory. Violence is also considered to be a socially acceptable way of quote-unquote being a real man. It is considered to be the only way to demonstrate hegemonic manhood. Given its man-made construction, mind the pun, the closest definition that I can arrive at when it comes to violence and masculinity is that hegemonic masculinity is a resource and violence is the tool to reproduce and sustain this resource. To become the hegemonic notion of the real man, one has to take up the role of the violent aggressor. Our next theme is traditional roles for men that comprising fathers and husbands, and the narratives in which we will take over for that. So take it away, Shashwati. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shashwati. I'm co-presenting this presentation with Mahika. Sorry about the little glitches with this one. I think you can still see everybody on my screen and probably moving around it, but we'll have to just make do. So to transition to the next phase of our talk and to address the transforming part of the theme, let's talk about roles and role models. The harsh reality, especially in India, is that men remain decision makers in communities. So when we talk about masculinity, especially in a largely patriarchal society such as India, it becomes important for us to recognize the common figures that patriarchy manifests itself in. For the Indian woman, it's the father and the husband. So it is with this central idea that we addressed our messaging in our work. For example, when we talk about the fact that men are key decision makers, we have to address the fact that not only are they key decision makers, the decisions that they make are based not in individual thinking, but instead community thinking. It thus becomes important to us that in order to begin this change in the community, we look at transforming such men, fathers, husbands, etc., into potential allies. But what exactly do we mean by allies? Because, allies can be a pretty loaded term. And so one of the questions that we grapple with is, how do we talk about men being allies and about masculinity itself without glorifying it? Here's how. We can talk about individual men who decide to take individual action in their own spaces and bring about change, whether it's a father who refuses to pay dowry or a husband who, along with his wife, takes on core responsibilities at home. We break down what masculinities mean. We ask men to be allies. So when we start looking at the kind of messaging and the kind of media we make, it's important for us to talk to these potential allies directly, to husbands and to fathers. As Breakthrough, we want to present to these men an alternative world with alternative narratives of masculinity through presenting simple, recognizable situations, but with a simple flip in the narrative. Let me share an example with you.
नहीं बिटिया, गांव में जब लड़कियां सयानी हो जाती हैं तो शादी करती हैं, मैट्रिक नहीं, समझी? क्या हुआ बेटी?
लोग कहते हैं मैं मैट्रिक पास नहीं कर सकती, आप मेरा शादी करवा देंगे।
मुझ पर विश्वास है तेरा? ये मेरा वादा है, तुम जरूर बनोगी मैट्रिक पास।
जब हर पिता करे बेटी से वादा कि 18 वर्ष से पहले ब्याह नहीं, तब बनेगी रश्मि मैट्रिक पास।
मैं हूँ रश्मि, मैट्रिक पास।
So the flip in the narrative here is obvious. Instead of taking the community and the traditional line, Rashmi's father took a simple step. He valued his daughter's choice and agency. And in the process, he might become a role model for other fathers like him. But speaking of fathers, here's a letter written by a father to other fathers like him.
नमस्ते। यो खत मैं आपको इसलिए लिख रहा हूँ क्योंकि आप जो दिक्कत आपको है वही कुछ साल पहले मुझे भी हुआ करती थी। मारी छोरी और उसके सपने की। तो ध्यान से सुनिए और जो मैं कहता हूँ वही कीजिए। आपकी छोरी का सपना एक सपना ही रहने दीजिए। वो चाहे कितनी भी जिद करे उसकी एक न सुनना। छो क्यों रहे हो? मैं सच ही कह रहा हूँ, क्योंकि मान लो आपने एक बार उसकी सुन ली फिर तो सब बदल ही जाना है ना। पहले तो वो आपकी एक न सुनेगी, फिजूल खर्चा करेगी, आपको जबरदस्ती अपने पुराने कपड़ों से दूर करेगी, फिर एक करारा नया पोशाक दिलावेगी, वो भी हर 2 महीने में। वो भूल जावेगी कि आपका घर आपका है, वो पराया घर है। बिना पूछे आपके घर की मरम्मत करवा देगी। और तो और आप चाहे जितना मना करो, आपके छोटे से छोटे जो काम के लिए भी आपको बड़े से बड़े अस्पताल ले जावेगी। शादी में भी दिक्कत आवेगी। इतने सारे रिश्ते जो आवेंगे आप बौखला जावेंगे। इतनी मेहनत से जो आपने नाम कमाया है उसका क्या फायदा? बाहर निकले तो आप उसके पिता के नाम से ही जाने जावेंगे, जैसे लोग अब मुझे जानने लगे हैं। छोरी का सपना कुचलने की हिम्मत न हुई मारे से। उम्मीद करता हूँ ये पढ़ने के बाद आपकी भी ना होवेगी। आपका शुभचिंतक साक्षी मलिक का बापू।
आप भी अपनी बेटी को पढ़ाएं, लिखाएं और लिखने दें उसे आपकी और अपनी नई किस्मत। क्योंकि लड़की पढ़ेगी, आगे बढ़ेगी तो सिर्फ उसकी नहीं आपकी भी शान बढ़ेगी।
So quick context for folks who don't know. The Sakshi Malik mentioned here, The Sakshi Malik who's mentioned here is actually Sakshi Malik, who's the first Indian wrestler to win a medal at the Olympics. Her story is well known, especially as one known for breaking gender barriers to excel in her chosen field. So the letter, which starts off with a twist, now comes to a recognizable end. The flip, of course, being that this is the father of a famous sports person speaking, whose words already have value within the community and who's already presenting an alternative narrative of his own. The impact is that his is a real life alternative one. And because of that, his words are all the more impactful to the fathers that he's potentially speaking to. What Sakshi Malik's father chose to do was an exception then, but it didn't have to be. By writing that letter, he is setting an example. And that is something that we're endeavoring to build, men being positive role models for other men, especially if they are men in positions to inspire, such as Sakshi Malik's father is. But speaking of alternative role models, here's another one which is addressing a silent burden of many Indian women, the concept of the double burden of work. Let me give you some quick context for the video we're about to show you. The story in this is that a woman comes home and she's tired. And when her husband also comes home, he asks her to make some food for him while he settles down to watch a cricket match. That's when she decides to ask him to take up equal partnership at home. And it's all done through some fun song and dance. I hope you enjoy this.
परोसा है खाना सजनी चख कर देखो तो चटनी बात में भुला है मेरा दिल चखो तो दाल जरा मखनी कैसा बना है बतलाओ अरे देखो यूं ना मुस्काओ अज दाल हो तू भात हूँ मैं मेरे हाथों से खाओ सजनी कभी पकाओ तुम कभी पकाऊं मैं हाँ कभी पकाओ तुम कभी पकाऊं मैं अपना बना रहे साथ काम कर कर आज तुम थक गई लो मैंने पकाया दाल भात मैं ही अखियों से देखो ना सभी मैंने समझी तेरी बात लाल लाल अखियों से घूमना पिया मेरे मन की समझो बात आज मेरे मन की समझो बात आज मेरे मन की समझो बात
I hope you enjoyed that. It's a pretty funky song. But it's pretty obvious that when we talk about masculinity, it's kind of impossible to do so without talking about work, especially the concept of work at home, being acknowledged as work, and work that is shared between a couple and not purely like a woman's domain. So we decided to flip the script with this one and talk directly to husbands. We wanted to present an alternative where husbands were shown appreciating a wife's work and also sharing in their work. This isn't the only thing that we've done. We also, here's a still from one of our short films, Kaam Dono Ka, which translates as the work belongs to both of them, which also talks about a household where the husband steps forward and shares and appreciates in his wife's work. But we're also running kind of short on time. So I'll wrap up here, but I would like to say that a lot of our work, this is just a short glimpse on the stuff that we have worked on. You can find a lot of our work on our handles and our channels. My colleague Mahika will be sharing our links below of our YouTube and Instagram channels. Please do come check it out. We'd love to hear back from you if you have any feedback or if you have any thoughts. And that's a wrap from us. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
Thanks so much. Thanks for that, Saraswati and Mahika. And I do encourage everyone to check out Breakthrough's amazing work on digital, social, on YouTube and everything. It's really great. And please put in some questions. I see a comment from Giles. Thanks for that. Really appreciate that comment. I'll just read through it now. I think it's a good point, a good question anyway. It comes up quite a lot. It may be difficult to turn them, I think men, you mean, into allies if they're seen as toxic. I'm not sure the toxic masculinity framework is really helpful, too often used to telling that there is nothing to do with men. In your examples, you also use some traditional masculinity conceptions like being a good father as keys to changing and put away some negative conceptions. And I think there's definitely a lot of discussion around the terminology of toxic masculinity and a lot of articles out there expressing where it's useful and how it can be used productively, or sometimes how it might be less useful, but I'm sure everyone at Breakthrough is really already super conscious of those discussions. So with that, let's move on to the next conversation, which is going to be with Russ Ervin Funk. Russ is a consultant, trainer, and longtime activist and community organizer focusing on anti-racism and gender justice. He has more than 30 years experience in mobilizing men to end gender-based violence, providing therapeutic and other support services to men and boys, and working with communities, campuses, and organizations. His work focuses on the intersections of racial, gender, and sexuality justice, focusing on integrating intersectional practices. He's the co-founder of North American Men Engaged Network, and thanks a lot for joining, Russ, and over to you.
Good morning from the US. Good afternoon, good evening. Hope you all are well. I am excited to be a part of this panel. I'm a bit distracted, I have to admit, by the power of both Jocelyn and Saraswati and Mahika's presentation, but trying to focus on my own game here at the moment. So I'm going to talk a bit about the program, What's Wrong with This Picture. As Tom indicated, men's viewing of pornography is widespread and popular, and it's so normalized, it's unconditionally accepted. And so What's Wrong with This Picture is a program that helps, designed to help men unpack their own experiences of viewing pornography. There are two main resources right now. We are developing more as we go. to this program. One is this educational booklet that provides an overview of the impact of men's viewing pornography, and the other is this curriculum that is designed to be user-friendly in terms of you all being able to pick this up, adopt it, adapt it, use it in your own context. I'll talk a little bit about that process in this presentation. So just as part of a context, like all media, pornography transmits values and a storyline that is beneath the visible storyline. And as media consumers, we tend to consume the underlying values of any media that we're watching, just like we're consuming the storyline. Whether you're watching, I have an 11-year-old, so right now we're going through another round of watching the Avengers story movies. There's inherent value that is being transmitted by the Avengers story. But if we're not paying attention, we consume those values just like we consume the media itself. With any context, all of us know the need to develop a critical media lens as we are viewing media and pay attention to those values that we're consuming without paying attention. And with pornography, because it's so normalized and so accepted and so unconditionally consumed, men don't have any kind of conversations around their pornography use, much less critical. So we're not paying attention to those values that we're consuming, and certainly don't pay attention to how the values that are presented in pornography that we're consuming conflict with our own stated values. And that creates some significant challenges for us in terms of our work of advancing gender justice and racial justice. So as we'll talk about this, I'm going to talk briefly about some of the problems of that we know about men's viewing pornography, and then get into the program. So as this slide says, pornography does not demonstrate affection. Oh, let me also clarify that for this program, we are talking specifically about heterosexual mainstream pornography. If there's questions about that, we can get that to the other side. This is not designed for gay male pornography. The issue of lesbian pornography does come up, but the men who I work with who are viewing lesbian pornography are not viewing it for lesbian sexuality or lesbian empowerment. So with that, just this quick caveat. So what research tells us is that these are some of the impacts of men's viewing pornography. I'm not going to read this to you, or you all can read this to yourselves. As a side note, if you want a copy of the slide or any of the information, it's available on the website, or you can reach me directly. I'll put my contact information in the chat at the end. There are very clear negative impacts for men's viewing pornography that in many ways are directly related to their viewing pornography, but also recognizing that pornography use is in the context of, as we have talked about, toxic masculinity, or I prefer the term patriarchal masculinity, that is in the air we breathe. So pornography is not the only way that men decrease their empathy for rape victims, for example. It is one more method that patriarchy uses in order to decrease men's empathy. And these impacts are both for men on the individual level in terms of their own beliefs and values and how they relate to and treat, women, sex, themselves, but also in terms of men's overall views around the social norming and the social context in which men rape women and other men. Now, a key factor in terms of men's experience of viewing pornography that is different and distinct from other kind of media viewing is that men tend to masturbate while they're viewing, which has an impact of magnifying what happens when men view pornography. So in the overall context, as we talked about, when you're viewing media and you're doing it uncritically, you tend to consume the values of that of that media. But with masturbation, which all the evidence indicates is heightens the brain activity around what you're viewing. It increases the way that you understand, listen to, and internalize the values of the media that you're consuming, because masturbation goes to the pleasure centers of the brain. And that just highlights, if you look at any of the research on the impact, the brain brightens up when you are stimulating the pleasure points at the same time that you're doing learning. That magnifies the learning. So that's true if you're learning math. That's true if you're learning. That's part of the reason that the arts are so important as a learning methodology, because it stimulates the brain activity and it increases the learning and it deepens the learning. So if men are masturbating, and they tend to, when they're viewing pornography, then it heightens the learning. It magnifies the learning that's going on while they're viewing this pornography. So all of those imageries, all of those values that women like to be hit, liked to be talked, called names when they're during sex, that women like to be dominated during sex, that sex is a purely physical action with no emotion or spirituality attached, that the imagery, the storyline, that there's no affection as a part of pornography. All of those storylines, all of those messages, all of those lessons are magnified because men are masturbating and driving those messages, driving those lessons into the brain, because of the pleasure stimulation that's going on. In addition, the fact that viewing pornography tends to be a collective experience for men, it also magnifies the value. If you are in a social network that is either in real or perceived to be uncritically accepting the values of the media, that increases the impact of the media, that increases the lessons learned from viewing that media. Now, I want to make a caveat about this quote unquote collective experience. I'm not suggesting that men are always viewing pornography or typically view pornography in a group format. From the research, that appears to be that is a common process. But this a collective experience it includes the fact that men assume that men in their circles are viewing pornography too. So while a lot of men's experiences of viewing pornography is in fact with them in isolation by themselves, viewing pornography and masturbating, usually in silence. This fact that men know, assume, and trust that the other men in their peer group, other men in their friendship group are also viewing pornography and therefore approving it, means that men's experiences that they are assuming that other men are approving the norms and the values that are being transmitted in pornography. And that also magnifies the impact, magnifies the learning. So there are some, in addition to the fact that the lessons that men are learning from viewing pornography, the fact that it's magnified because they're masturbating and in this collective experience of viewing pornography, means that we've got some significant work to do in terms of internalizing some way to help men critically look at the way that they're viewing pornography in terms of our work to promote and advance gender justice. All right. So there is a community of porn users. Pardon me. As this is a little bit dated at this point, but as the research indicated on the slide suggests, men in male peer groups, such as fraternities, male teams, male sports teams, men in the military, men who are in all male peer groups tend to view pornography more often than other men. The influence of quote unquote male peer support, which is a concept developed by Walter de Casadri and Martin Schwartz. This concept of male peer support reinforces the norms presented in pornography. This kind of goes back to this notion earlier of the collective use of the viewing of pornography. And there's this concept of the flatlining of any variance of men's perceptions of pornography. What I mean by that is through the experience of the What's Wrong with This Picture program, which I'll get into in more detail in a minute, where we open up the conversation amongst men around their real experiences of viewing pornography, what we're finding is that men actually have different lines in the sand about the kinds of pornography that they're willing to view or willing to watch. So as an example, kind of a line in the sand that is true across the board is around child pornography. And men, it's part of the package. Men don't look at child pornography. But there are different lines in the sand, for example, of men's comfort in watching bonding or S&M as part of pornography. Or we've had men in the groups talk about when they see any kind of hitting, any kind of name calling, any kind of slapping, that immediately turns them off and they need to view to a different channel of what they're watching. But those nuances aren't exposed because men's pornography viewing is so normalized that it's this hidden reality that just is everywhere. So men don't know that other men have these different these variances, these nuances around the kinds of pornography that they're viewing and what that means to them. So there's this assumption that all men like all pornography, and that's absolutely not true, based on our experience with the What's Wrong with This Picture program. So real quickly, I'm going to dive into the overview, and I'm very aware that this is a very truncated presentation, and I apologize for that, but here's a taste. So it is the program is 8 sessions long. It's designed to be 90 minutes each session. They are facilitated conversations. They are very activity heavy. Every session has at least 2 activities that we engage the men in. There's one homework assignment, which I'll get into as I describe some of the sessions. It's heavily based on a media literacy approach. And the goals are A, to develop men's critical awareness of the impact of viewing pornography. And the second goal is to increase men's compassion for the experiences of viewing pornography. Now, I often get the question of how do I get men to come to this program? And our experience is that it's very difficult to do a community call. I'm based in Louisville, Kentucky, to do a community call and say, hey men, we're having a critical conversation about pornography. Want to come? That tends not to work. No matter how sexy or presentable we try and do that community call. Men aren't trying to come to a program like this. How it works that we found is when we go to groups where men are already in a group, particularly if that group is already involved in some kind of critical dialogue, then they tend to be willing to let us come in and borrow 8 weeks or 8 sessions with their group of men. So that might be a Bible study or a Torah group in a faith community. It might be a fraternity or a men's sports team. It might be a neighborhood group that meets on a regular basis. Any kind of group that's already in existence can be, we found, can be approached in terms of recruiting the group to engage in this curriculum as a part of their groupness, if you'll follow me. The other benefit of that is that this program really requires a level of bravery amongst the group members in order them to get as honest as we're inviting them to get. So if this is a group, and we have done this, if this is a group where it's men who don't know each other, then the first part of the group is really developing this brave space amongst them, so that they can get to that level of honesty and vulnerability. If it's a group that's already in existence, that has already created this sense of bravery amongst each other so that men can be vulnerable with each other, then we can spend less time doing that and more time on the content. How this program evolved, it began in 2015 as a project of the organization that was at that time called Men's Work Eliminating Violence Against Women. The program evolved around our work as Men's Work, our work in trying to engage and mobilize men here locally to challenge and confront gender-based violence, knowing how common pornography viewing was, and looking around and realizing there wasn't anything around at that time that helped men to look at the impact of pornography use in their attitudes about gender-based violence, their perpetration of gender-based violence, or their willingness to be an ally and work against gender-based violence. So what we realized is that without addressing it directly and integrating it into the rest of the work that we were doing, we were having these conversations with men to try and engage them in the work to end gender-based violence. And some of them were going home to watch pornography, which undermined all of the lessons that we were trying to teach them. And again, undermined them in a way, remembering what we talked about earlier about masturbation while you're viewing pornography and going to the pleasure points in the brain and therefore reinforcing the lesson, reinforcing it in a way that we couldn't, because our group conversations, the process that we have, while we try to make them quote unquote pleasurable, the pleasure pales in comparison to the pleasure that men experience from viewing pornography. So we found ourselves in this position of really swimming upstream against not only all of the other factors that contribute to men's hesitation to getting actively engaged in promoting in promoting gender equality, but in addition, on the intrapersonal level, they have their own experience where they're getting very positive outcomes on orgasm to the very attitudes, values around gender and around sex and sexuality that we're trying to confront. So we developed this program as a standalone, but also as a way that can be integrated into other work, so that we can start these conversations of these critical conversations of men's viewing pornography. The curriculum was developed using emergent curriculum design. For those of you who aren't aware, emergent curriculum design uses participants in the program, in the early iterations of the program, as co-authors of the curriculum. So as we develop this, Men's Work Collective would develop the first kind of outline, the first sessions of the workshop, take it to men and ask them, as they're participating, to actively participate, to think about what other activities can we come up with, what other resources can we have, how do we shift the conversation. The early authors were the participants in the program. That's important to keep in mind because we want to keep that notion that this is an emergent process as a part of presenting the curriculum itself. And then as we continue to develop it, and at each iteration, we can engage critical feedback from other sources, other feminists in the community, other leaders in the country working around these issues to get their critical feedback on the curriculum as we developed it. What we found is that there's actually a continuum of men's pornography use or men's attitudes about viewing pornography. Everything from men who are opposed and critical to viewing pornography to men who are active supporters and users. It is nuanced, not static. As we talked about earlier, men have actually varied perspectives about viewing pornography and about pornography itself, including the men who are viewing pornography. What we have found is that a lot of the men who view pornography actually have some very mixed feelings and ambivalent feelings about viewing pornography. But again, because there's no space for men to talk about their experience of viewing pornography, there's no opportunity for them to talk about the fact that they do have this ambivalence and nuance about their own experience of viewing pornography. Tom, I want to check in. I can't see a clock. Can you give me a time check?
We are on 18 minutes.
Okay, so let me zoom in. So here's the 8 sessions. It started with the first 6 sessions are really about the content of pornography and men's experience of it. The last 2, which again grew out of this emergent process, starts to encourage men to be active in the work. The first one is the bystander to ally session is really focused on what men's experience as an individual and how they can ally to work to end gender-based violence. And the last session, being a part of the solution, is a collective experience about how they as a group can move forward and take action. So a couple of quick highlights that I want to present. So the first session, as part of the overview, is we invite men to think about their first experience of viewing pornography and reflect on that and share those stories. And what we found every time is that if men reflect on their own pornography use, that first experience was nuanced and ambivalent. There were things that they liked about it. There were also things that they hated about it. There were things that they enjoyed. There were elements that scared them. But they've never been able to talk about it. And so what that means, if that's their initial experience, what we know from brain science is that if that was their initial experience, then that nuance and that ambivalence is replicated every time they view it, because they're not able to unpack it and explain and explore what this ambivalence was. The fact that they can hear each other share their stories is incredibly powerful in having them understand that their experience is not a new experience, that ambivalence is collective. And it opens the door for some critical thinking about pornography use. Another exercise that we do is the one homework activity that I talked about earlier. It's after session 4, between 4 and 5. We ask participants to, it's an activity that we call walk a mile in her shoes, sort of. And so we invite men to connect with a peer, woman friend of theirs, not a daughter, not a mother, preferably not a sister, but someone that they actually view as a peer. And your job as a man is to walk behind her through a public space and just notice how men treat her. Notice the things that men say. Notice the things that men do. Notice how men look at her, either trying to be nonchalant and not seem like they're checking her out, or the way they do it overtly. And then come back and unpack that experience of, actually, for most of these men, the first time getting some kind of lived experience of what the frequency and commonality of street harassment. And then as we unpack it, we look at what's the role of pornography in viewing that, in how men feel entitled to talk about women and talk to women in those ways. So some of the evidence of impact, real quickly, as I'm outlining here, male participants tend to have they report higher levels of discomfort of their own pornography use. They report a decreased willingness to engage in other forms of sexual exploitation, and they report an increased willingness to engage in prevention activism. One of the things that we've also found is, so as a part of the program, we have 8 weeks, and we invite them in to consider not using pornography for the 8 weeks that they're in the group. And as we wrap things up, we ask them to share their experience of not viewing pornography for the 8 weeks. And for most of the men, this has been the first time that they've gone through 8 weeks of not viewing pornography. As they reflect on that experience of what does that mean in a whole host of areas, they share some really powerful lessons around what it means for them to, if you will, just start to come clean around sexuality, sex, their experience of sex without pornography, their experience of masturbating without pornography. It unpacks a different kind of learning than just talking about this. I think that puts me at my time. Good, that's the last slide. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I look forward to the questions and the conversation.
Thanks, Russ. And yeah, please do keep putting your questions in. We've had a few comments, which is great. And in the interest of time, I think we are going to move on and welcome our last but not least speaker, Shohini. So yeah, Shohini, welcome. Shohini is a global advocate for gender equality with specific expertise, gender-based violence programming and prevention. After spending a year in the US working on international women's rights policy and advocacy, she returned to India, where she spent the next 5 years implementing a psychosocial program for access to justice organizations. Her work has ranged from providing direct support to survivors of sexual violence to conducting research on gender-based violence globally. Currently, she is working as an independent gender and development consultant, building training curriculums on GBV for online and offline support, supporting gender analysis projects and policy briefs, and is going to be presenting a really interesting topic. So over to you, Shohini.
Thank you so much, Tom, and I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so thank you to everyone who presented here, who's present here today, and we've seen some fantastic programs being presented and concepts by the other panelists. My topic is slightly different in that I will be talking about not a program, but rather an existing medium where people tell their stories. I will be talking about TikTok, the users, the content created on TikTok, the representation of stories, and lastly, just briefly touch upon the concept of design and its connection to ensuring a more equitable medium that people can use to tell their stories. So imagine that you're online and a video pops up. It starts off with a familiar Indian movie scene. There's a guy and a girl engaged in flirtation. Another guy is approaching them in hurt and betrayal. But instead of the emotions being directed at the girl, as would be expected in the Indian movie, he expresses his hurt and betrayal to his male lover, challenging the heteronormative expectation of the audience. But this isn't a video in an Indian movie or an edutainment piece by an organization. It is a post by a user on TikTok. TikTok, which is currently banned in India as of June 2020 for geopolitical reasons, had become a space where stories and representations not usually found on mainstream media was being developed and circulated. And not only that, this content was also receiving a lot of attention, both positive and negative. But before I talk about the phenomenon that was TikTok, I just want to take a step back and look at the online space in India. A study by the Internet and Mobile Association of India in 2017 found that there were about 65% of urban internet users, whereas the number was about 20% for rural users. The same study, it's conducted yearly, going back in 2015, found that internet penetration in rural India was only about 9%. Interestingly enough, though, in 2019, the number of rural users became 10% more than the number of urban users. Despite this promising statistic, the digital space is still quite exclusionary. So just as a note for everyone, some relevant information to know. First of all, smartphones in India are the most popular medium of accessing digital space. I'll be talking about the upper caste. It's a common term referring to people who are historically in a position of privilege, power, access to resources, and then scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, which is the official designated groups of India who are historically marginalized and oppressed. So a 2014 study found that the ratio of smartphone users from upper caste communities in comparison to scheduled caste and scheduled tribe was almost 2-1. Not only that, there's also a huge gender gap. From 2017 to 2019, although the number of female users, internet users increased and the number of male internet users decreased, it's the male population still makes up for about 2/3 of the entire population of internet users. Similarly, about 63% of women own smartphones, but only 21% have access to internet. So there's definitely a limitation of access to digital space, especially for some communities. It usually consists mostly of upper caste heterosexual men. There's also then the issue of representation. Mainstream media has very little representation, especially looking at the intersection of caste and gender or sexuality and gender. Even when this might exist, stories and content is often stereotypical or regressive, and content is not created by the people of that identity. So these stories are often represented from a place of privilege, and that is, as the presenters in Breakthrough talked about in India, that masculinity, that place of privilege is quite aggressive. Pose at that, for example, with user Pooja on TikTok, who's a trans woman who gained a huge following as she danced to Bollywood music on local trains. The lack of access and representation is due to India's sociocultural context. I won't go into it too much, but just very briefly, every 15 minutes, a crime is committed against someone from the Dalit community. About 37% of people in India believe that homosexuality should not be accepted by society. And this is after there have been some changes and increasing acceptance of homosexuality. There's also homosexuality is no longer criminalized in India, and there is an act that has been passed recently for the protection of transgender persons, but that act also has some problematic elements. But being openly queer in India can lead to consequences of losing your family, losing your home, income, and practices like conversion therapy is still present in India today. And lastly, just looking at gender very briefly, India ranked 112 out of 153 countries in the Global Gap Index in 2020. And actually, like the higher you are, the more gender equal your country is, just pointing that out. So that was the digital and social context in which we were looking at the stories that were represented in TikTok. Why did TikTok gain so much popularity compared to other social medias? Very briefly, three main things. The first is it's a visual medium. It doesn't require literacy. It's the image-based app is also more attractive and can garner attention easily. Secondly, these videos are 15-second videos, so users don't have to spend that much time creating content. There are also templates like background music that are present, challenges, so users can utilize these existing templates to tell their own stories. Lastly, there's a wide range of
Shohini, I think the sound has gone a little bit quiet. I'm not sure what happened. It kind of just went, but maybe if just so you're aware.
Okay, can you hear me or no?
It's gone a bit quiet. It's still a bit quiet. I am turning up my volume and that seems to work. I wonder if that will work for others as well. But maybe let's continue. So you're audible, but it's just a little bit like you're on the other side of the room now.
Okay, I will try and
Better. That was better, thanks.
speak louder. I'll just turn up the volume. Just give me 1 second. Okay, is this better?
Thanks, yeah, that's better.
Okay, great. Just turning up the volume. Right, so the last main factor that makes TikTok so easy to use is that it has a wide range of audience. Unlike other social media platforms, you don't need to be friends with people for that content to be viewed. With very little mainstream representation and content that's not been created by the community, social media becomes a space to take control of this information and tell their own stories. Now, here I must pause and share that these are my interpretation of the impact of these stories. And I don't hope to represent or misrepresent a community, but just simply share a perspective. So whereas social media users on YouTube or Instagram seem affluent, TikTok users are a lot more grounded. Take, for example, user Gaikund, who lives in a farming village in Western India. She amassed about 500,000 followers, posting everyday videos of her going to the market. The idea of cool became different. It was embraced and celebrated. And that's not to say that it wasn't disparaged as well, which I will talk about briefly later on. When looking at stories from the queer community, the example that I shared in the beginning, plus other queer couples, users who were using heteronormative Bollywood songs to challenge this perspective and show queer romance. Here was a space of masculinity that's not seen in the mainstream space. So when in 2020, in last year, with the ban of TikTok, it felt like there was this loss of that space. And as a journalist shared, teenagers and non-binary LGBTQI plus folks from tier 2 and tier 3 cities across India had embraced the medium that allowed their everydayness, their queerness, and just their own selves to become accepted and even popular. Lastly, we'll look at the stories that were coming out from women, often young Dalit women, and how they told their stories. For example, a young woman points to a photo of Dr. Ambedkar. And Dr. Ambedkar is a Dalit leader who advocated for the annihilation of caste, wrote the Indian Constitution, and is a huge influence for social reform. So a young woman points to a photo of Dr. Ambedkar while a romantic Bollywood song is sung by a male singer in the background. The lyrics of the song go, "Where will I go leaving you? Without you, I will die." Originally, the song was about some heteronormative romance, but this user takes that and implants it into this political context and emphasizes the importance of Dr. Ambedkar, his work, and its crucialness to the Dalit community. It is also a representation of Dalit pride in a society that is oppressive towards them. And it's not just a threat to it's a threat to existing gender roles. As the Internet Democracy Project report, What Sex Got to Do with It, found that these women whose primary identity has been expected to be tied to their home, whether as a mother or daughter or wife, defied social expectations in their embrace of apps such as TikTok and online fun and fame and fortune that accompanied their use. There have been reports of women being divorced for posting videos on TikTok that were damaging to family values. There are reports that women were murdered by their husbands for posting on TikTok. And as researcher Sujata Subramaniam talks about, women's bodies are often seen as sites of cultural conflicts. By embracing TikTok, by telling their stories so openly and unabashedly, it is seen as a threat to the traditional gender roles that relegate a woman to their homes and is usually in spaces of silence. But it's also seen as a threat to national identity. And the whole notion of Indianness, which is especially relevant in today's context. So, as one user said, social media is the only media space that has really provided the subaltern caste with the most free and least discriminatory platform to create their discourse and ideate. And if representation is a way to disrupt the existing hierarchies of who should and shouldn't be in a space, then these users have been able to do that just through their stories. But as with all social media spaces, it's not without its own problems. There have been instances of misogyny and normalized violence, caste-based hate speech, bullying of queer youth, and general culture of rejection by some people. For example, a Wired study looking at hate speech against Dalits noticed that TikTok algorithm quickly caught on to what they were searching. And so they ended up finding lots of accounts advocating caste supremacy and casteist speech. In just 2 months, there were about 500 examples of caste-based hate threats, violence, and ridicule within just the Tamil language. And just to put it in context, that's one of the 22 recognized major languages. In terms of misogyny and normalized violence, there have been lots of instances of videos where men are seen hitting women, and that's completely normalized. In terms of bullying of queer youth, there was an example of a case where a 23-year-old committed suicide after being teased online for dressing like a girl on TikTok. The challenging of mainstream representation through these stories on TikTok are often perceived as a threat to the status quo of nationalistic masculinity, and the response is often in the form of abuse. Now, there are other problems relating to concerns of big data, privacy and surveillance, problematic algorithms, and I won't talk about that much. All these issues don't just exist on TikTok. This exists offline, it exists on other online media spaces. There have been attempts to curb these negative influences through tech companies, in the creation of better reporting channels, governments and legislation. There's been court interventions, policy changes. So this is definitely a policy problem and a social norm issue that needs to be changed. But the stakeholder that I particularly want to look at is the involvement of designers. So designers are the people who are creating these apps. They often create these apps with the principle of product over people. Even when they do prioritize people, they often have solutions like creating user personas, which are still limiting. They're often not looking at the offline hierarchical systems that can have an impact online. And the focus is on the intention of this app rather than the actual outcome and potential outcome to the community. With social media, apps, and just the online space having the ability to catalyze a problem due to the speed of uptake and its scale in the digital space, designers cannot work in isolation separate from the community who are impacted. Whether it's bias or ignorance or unintentional consequences that perpetuate the systems of oppression, a designer, just by virtue of the values that they put into creating a product can cause significantly more damage than the person on the street. And therefore, they have a responsibility to take a look at what are the changes that need to be made to make more inclusive technology. So one of these concepts that have come about is the approach of design justice, which is primarily a solution that emerged from designers themselves. I'm not a designer or from the design justice space, so I don't want to represent the principles, but I will briefly go through the general outlook this has. The purpose of design, according to the design justice principles, is to heal and seek liberation from exploitative systems. It acknowledges that designers are not the experts, but those who are impacted by the design outcome, they are. And they should be at the center of all design solutions. It's a community-first approach rather than a designer-first approach, and it prioritizes the impact on the community rather than the intention of the designer. So there's often been solutions that have been created, so design for social good, technology for social good, and that have unintended negative consequences. But the rationale is often that, you know, this was for a positive reason, so the intention is matter. But design, the intention is what matters. But design justice takes a step back and says that no, that's not enough. Design justice also talks about looking at what's already working and looking at change as a collaborative, ongoing process rather than an afterthought or an end product. Now, traditionally, design principles are single axis. Design principles and practices are single axis and often erase certain groups. But design justice as a field of theory looks at how design objects, products, and systems can influence and redistribute the risks and moves beyond the framework of good intentions being enough. Design justice is not the only concept that exists that talks about shifting the existing design structure or architecture. There's equity design, inclusive design, universal design. I won't go into it too much because I think I'm running out of time. But just to kind of wrap up, media is a powerful tool that can shape norms towards gender equality. But on the other hand, it can also promote discriminatory attitudes and hierarchies of oppression. In social norm change through media, some of the strategies that are used are debunking of norms, making change visible, stories of deviation, and mass engagement. And whether intentionally or unintentionally, these were all utilized by many of the users on TikTok in the telling of their stories. However, where social norm change through media requires dialogue and reflection in a space like TikTok, this is not possible. But as Jocelyn shared in her presentation of Men's Story Project, having a safe space to share your stories is a crucial ingredient. Therefore, there's a need for activists, policymakers, and especially designers to work with users together and those from the community to imbibe principles of design justice and co-create products which are value-driven and for the community. So I leave it at that, and I will hopefully be able to discuss. If anyone has questions, please let us know, and I look forward to discussing some of these concepts with the other panelists.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Shohini. And yeah, thanks for that reminder to everybody. Please do share questions. We are very grateful to all the speakers, and we've had diverse and very informative and inspiring presentations. But now we have, just under 20 minutes. So this is your chance to ask questions. I think you should see a hand-raising feature in the chat box or the participants list. I forget where it is. But if you're used to Zoom, please do use that hand-raising feature, because we're going to open the floor, essentially. And you'll be able to unmute and share a question now if you've got one. And just asking you to keep your intervention to a minute or less, ideally, Pooja, so thank you. I see you've raised your hand. Let's hear from you. Over to you, Pooja.
Thank you, Tom. So, I mean, it's more of a comment for Saraswati and Mahika. You know, I really appreciated the videos. I mean, I'm based in Hong Kong, but basically as a diasporic Indian, I can really relate to the context within which these videos are set. And knowing how obsessed the nation is with Bollywood and its impact and its pervasiveness across homes, not just in India, but also the diaspora who carry many of these norms. I think it's vital to find a way to reach them. And I think that these simple videos achieve that. And so, yeah, you know, I noticed there was a comment earlier by Gillies, you know, to the effect that this reinforces certain types of masculinity. And I think that that is true, but maybe this can be seen as the first step toward engagement. And then the second question that I do have is for our last presenter, and that's on this issue of counter narratives. And I see again, someone else has raised this comment in the chat as well. You know, counter narrative work often imposes a burden on the communities that are often the targets of the, you know, the discriminatory or hateful speech in the first place. And I understand that you're proposing a comprehensive framework by marrying sort of design engineers with social justice advocates and all of that. But I'm wondering, how do we enlist the communities that are the targets, who very often might not realize they're the targets or worry about being further targeted if they stand up as part of the counter narratives? How do we do that work while still protecting, or I guess, situating these communities in a way that they don't become even further diminished by the hateful speech that they encounter online? Thank you so much for these very enriching presentations.
And thank you for that, those points, Pooja. So yeah, great. I think, should we start? Shohini, would you like to respond first, and then we can move on to the other point raised?
So I think when I'm talking about the creating more inclusive space, I think it's important to acknowledge that the burden of challenging mainstream narratives should not be placed on the most oppressed communities. What I'm simply suggesting is that the spaces that are created, these apps that are created, the digital communities should be created in a way that, so I'm putting the burden actually on designers to say that they need to acknowledge the systems of oppression that exist and understand how that plays into the products that they create. And here it would be important to work with social justice activists and of course people from the community to preemptively create something that doesn't put the burden of this work on the communities that are most affected. I don't know if that sufficiently answered the question.
It does, thank you.
Thanks. And I think, looking from my point of view, Shohini, your presentation made me think that the really powerful narratives are not coming from people like me, and I'm in a position of extreme privilege, not just based on identity, but I'm supporting this global network with communications. So we have a platform, but it makes me wonder, what more should we do to amplify those voices who are in the more, they're using these places for empowerment. I'm not personally, yeah.
Sorry, and it's just the everydayness. I think what I want to emphasize is not that these places are necessarily, or the users are intentionally trying to make a political statement, but rather that their ideation, their discourse, and just their everydayness. I mean, I think that quote about the queer community and them just being able to live their everydayness, I think these apps need to be able to create that space more than anything.
Thank you, Shohini. Jocelyn, go ahead.
Just to add a thought to that, you know, I think what I've found in the Men's Story Project is that it's helpful. I found that it's helpful to hear stories from and to create a platform where people with diverse identities and forms of privilege, or who are dealing with different forms of oppression or marginalization, can all speak. But the folks who are coming from places of privilege are often sharing stories of unlearning in some regard. So for example, the person who talked about how and why he unlearned homophobia, or men who used to perpetrate violence who decided that they needed help, or who realized that they needed help and how they sought it. But for folks, for example, who've been sharing stories of what it's been like on the receiving end of homophobia or transphobia or racism or ableism, a common theme in terms of impacts that they've shared with me and with the project is a sense of empowerment, or a sense of that it was healing in some way for them to share their perspectives publicly. So, I think there's a need for sensitivity in how things are stewarded and how things are done. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a burden, for somebody to express themselves who's experienced marginalization. It can be an opportunity for self-expression, for empowerment, for saying what you really feel, what you really want people to know about you, rather than all of the prejudicial ideas or stigmas or assumptions and prejudices that you've been dealing with your whole life. So I think the way that it's done, the way the platform is framed, makes a big difference in how those, what the vibe is when those kinds of stories are communicated.
If I can also jump in, I think from my experience with what's wrong with this picture, and the same kind of question, I think, Jocelyn, to your point of being rigidly, that wasn't the word, I think rigorously was the word you used, trauma informed, is really part of this. Because in our experience, when we've had mixed race men in the room, what we've learned is racism is a huge part of mainstream pornography, and it significantly impacts how Black and brown men experience viewing pornography differently than white men. And if we want to create space where men can be brave, then it's our job, Shohini, to your point, as the platform, in this case, the facilitators, it's our job to make sure that the Black and brown men who share their stories and share their vulnerabilities about how racism and racial injustice and racial violence impacted their experience of viewing pornography is not just a learning opportunity for the white dudes. That's re-traumatizing. Yes, it can be empowering, but can also be significantly re-traumatizing when it's Black and brown people's responsibility to share their story and then attend to white people's response to them telling their stories. So it's part of our responsibility of really rigorously attending to can we encourage these storytellings that doesn't re-traumatize the Black and brown voices or the marginalized voices who are in these spaces to share their stories in the first place. Because as you all know, that's an incredible position of vulnerability. And when they're in these spaces, these shared spaces of oppression and marginalization and privilege and entitlement, how do we make sure that the job of attending to their needs and their vulnerabilities is cared for?
Thank you, Russ, and it's good to see more comments coming in. My only worry is we're going to not have ample time to discuss everything now. And I'm seeing another hand up from Tamara Garrod. Would you like to share now, Tamara, please?
Yes, thank you very much. I guess, first of all, I want to start by thanking all of the panelists. I am really glad to be starting my Thursday with several pages full of really exciting notes to be sending back to my colleagues. So yeah, thank you. Particularly thanks as well in the recent conversations to Shohini and Jocelyn for kind of thinking a little bit about, or starting to think collectively about the role which queer identities can play in kind of providing an alternative, or it's a questioning of patriarchal masculine gender norms. And I think it's a really interesting question about really how to involve and welcome people into the fold of Masculinities work who otherwise find themselves excluded in terms of gender areas. And I suppose it's a very open question, which I'm really interested in hearing from all the panelists, anyone who has something interesting to say on it, I suppose. But I suppose something I find intriguing is the way that Masculinities work has yet to really welcome into the fold transmasculine people, whether those be trans men themselves or otherwise identifying people who are, you know, presenting in masculine ways. And I guess I was, I suppose interested to hear from the panelists whether that's something that I am totally ignorant of and need to be sent loads of exciting links to, or whether you have like thoughts of how your own work can apply it in those ways. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Tamara. My sense is that I think a lot. I'm going to make a broad statement about the evolution of this field, and feel free to, if others have other perspectives. You know, I think that internationally, work around engaging men and boys for gender justice has had a focus on, you know, primary areas of focus have been gender-based violence prevention and response, HIV/AIDS prevention and response. And I think the whole universe of work around LGBTQ rights, equality, etc., has not been as central, certainly in the international body of work overall, on engaging boys and men. And I think it needs to be, and that's part of what I was, you know, thinking about when I was saying, you know, I think an intersectional gender justice perspective and social justice perspective is key. In almost all, if not all, of the Men's Story Project productions, there have been trans presenters, you know, and trans men are men. You know, I mean, there's zero debate in my mind on these topics, and so I think that it's essential and fundamental to the conversation to include perspectives and attention to the lived experiences of the LGBTQ community. You know, so yeah, and homophobia and transphobia are fundamental constituents of hegemonic masculinity, and so those things need to be named and addressed. So to me, it's a pretty clear topic.
Yeah, thanks for that response, Jocelyn. And we are short on time, so I just wanted to also bring in Saswati and Mahika back into the conversation, and specifically to address this topic, this question that Giles made in the chat and Pooja referred to as well, which is the framing of masculinity, patriarchal masculinity, toxic masculinity. Everywhere in the media, you hear the word and see the word toxic masculinity. And I think there was some discussion in the chat about that, but it'd be great to hear from you, from our colleagues at Breakthrough. Any thoughts on that?
Shashwati, can I start?
Absolutely, please go ahead.
Now, I'll just say something in defense of the term toxic masculinity. I don't think the intention for this term toxic masculinity as we know it was not it was not intended to kind of point fingers at somebody or kind of wag fingers at men and kind of, you know, reprimand them for it. When we say toxic masculinity, we meant like it's, you know, it's the adverse consequences of the existence of this masculinity. It can be obviously it impacts women and non-binary folks, but then again it is also harmful and has severe consequences for the men who perform this masculinity as well. So in that basis, that's why the term, like I said, the term toxic masculinity is not intended to kind of create a binary between good and bad men. And coming back to the comment that was previously raised, it's not like they're all for like kind of holding getting together a system of accountability, but at the same time there needs to be a kind of simultaneous narrative where one needs to address the fact that misogyny and toxic masculinity and hegemonic masculinity are learned processes. One isn't born a patriarch. There is an entire like a set of dominoes. There's a process that gets rolling from the minute that one is born, and one is born into deeply rooted existing patriarchal structures, and that kind of gets, and as such masculinity goes on to become a formative process for them, which is why again in my presentation I said that masculinity is both internal, that is our lottery of birth, and external, like what we have learned from our socio-cultural circuits, learn or unlearn from our immediate socio-cultural circuits. Shashwati, do you want to add something?
I actually think you've said pretty much everything I meant to say. Not specific to this conversation, but I just wanted to quickly thank Pooja for the point that she raised earlier, that, you know, thank you for liking her work, and also to not exactly tie in with this, but reference about often the things we show seem quite basic. Like if you recall, in one of the videos that we showed, there was the letter from the father there is a point which always strikes me where he says that, think about the proposal your daughter's going to get. There's going to be so many proposals. You'll drown in proposals. And it kind of seems like a really strange point to raise, especially in India, where marriage of women is such a dicey topic, because it's often seen as like the end result for women. You grow up and you go to school or whatever else, you get married. So it's it should be one of the systems that we should be defeating rather than promoting it. But what Pooja also raised was right, that often when we are talking to men and when we are talking in communities, it's a space of negotiation and navigation. And often in the voices that we are speaking to and the many masculinities that we confront within fathers and husbands, etc., and communities, the thing that we do not recognize if we confront them as how do I say it, as one seamless structure, as one hegemonic masculinity, then we do not recognize masculinities. We don't recognize that there are in fact people within that crowd of people who are possibly disagreeing with what the community is saying. So that's why we start by making very simple strategic things that people can do. That if someone says pay dowry for your daughter's marriage, we say it's like a simple thing, which is don't pay dowry for your daughter's marriage. And the recognition needs to be that that's a really hard thing to do. So that's the point that I want to raise. Thanks, Pooja, for bringing it up, actually.
I just wanted to make a comment about some of the thread that's in the chat about quote unquote safe spaces. Something that I have found to be helpful with the work of the Men's Story Project is this concept of co-creating a space that is safe, brave, and creative. And with the groups, we have a process of co-creating a set of group agreements, but also setting the stage that when people are coming with their draft stories in this case, and they're going to be going through learning modules together and then also story circles together. One of the things that we explicitly talk about is the value of productive discomfort. And that they are there, to help each other learn and grow, and that includes naming and taking the time to let people know if there's content in their story, for example, that's unintentionally oppressive, or the way that they say something is perpetuating harmful ideas. And so I just wanted to, because I saw that thread in the chat, I agree, that this is safe space unto itself can be very wimpy and permissive of a lot of junk, right? So the goal is to have a space where there's ground rules of how we're going to engage, with respect and with confidentiality and, all the basic ground rules for a group process. But with the idea, with understanding, that people who are, in the case of the Men's Story Project, joining it because they're clearly, part of the choir on a given topic, they may not be part of the choir on other topics. In other words, we might be progressive in some regards, or egalitarian or equitable in some regards, and be oppressive or non-egalitarian or prejudiced in other regards. And so we are complex people, and coming together as diverse groups, it's an opportunity to learn together and challenge each other. And the setting for that needs to be constructive, intentionally and explicitly, so that people can be prepared to be challenged, to be called in, to welcome those moments of productive discomfort where someone is giving them the gift of feedback on how they're being unintentionally oppressive, etc. So we're in that group process, you're basically creating a crucible kind of space for intensified learning processes.
Thank you, JC. And yeah, I think when we were planning this session, there was a lot of talk about the kind of methodology and how we do this kind of work in a way that is sensitive and respectful and transformative. We are at time, unfortunately, and there's some other really great conversations going on in the chat, so thanks for those. There were some points on working with younger people and children, I think especially on what you were discussing, Russ. Sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about that. And a lot of discussion about kind of counter narratives versus counter narratives, and the endless antagonistic cycle of narratives. But if they're not addressed in this session, we are having a whole load of other sessions. I'm just going to wrap up really quickly, but please do check out the other sessions. We're running pretty much every Tuesday, some Wednesdays, and pretty much every Thursday like today in this time slot. And those sessions are recorded and we're putting them on our YouTube channel. So just search for Men Engage Alliance on YouTube and you'll find us, and there should be a whole load of videos there, which you can look at through so many different topics. And there's a whole series on backlash and how do we engage with that. So do check that out if you're interested. So we are at time. Thanks again to our panelists, Russ, Shohini, Jocelyn, Mahika, and Saswati. So thanks so much, and thanks everyone for joining. It's been a great discussion. We didn't have time to go further, but I really appreciate everyone joining and hope that we'll see you again soon at some other symposium events. Thanks very much.